Thank you for attending my webinar today called The Shame We Carry. Diseases of the soul are more dangerous and more numerous than those of the body. This was something that was said a very long time ago by Cicero, and it seems to hold true even more so today. The thing that brought me to the idea that I wanted to create a webinar based upon the effects of shame was a recent blog, or actually a TED Talk that I had an opportunity to listen to. And it was titled The Price of Shame. And it was delivered by a woman who has experienced the effects profoundly, on a global scale, if you will. See, in the mid-90s, a young girl in her mid-20s was in the middle of what would be one of the greatest political scandals of all time. Monica Lewinsky referred to herself in the TED Talk as Patient Zero, for being possibly the first person whose shame was delivered globally online. Technologically enhanced shaming that was amplified, uncontained, and permanently accessible. A very dangerous thing. She talked about how that shame left her hiding in her room, in her home, unable to go out without somebody noticing her, wanting to talk to her, having a comment to share with her about her behavior, as if she didn't already feel such tremendous responsibility and guilt. She said, I was barely able to function. Her parents actually slept on her bedroom floor to make sure that she didn't attempt suicide, which was a very real concern that they should have had. She said, online, we've got a compassion deficit and an empathy crisis, and that shaming has become what she would call a blood sport in a culture of humiliation. That really hit me, the idea that we have created a culture that would be of humiliation. And I found the talk painful, but so poignant. So I wanted to talk about the power of shame in and on our lives. She went on, as she concluded, she said, they forgot I was dimensional, that I had a soul. And I think sometimes that is a real truth, that we can forget sometimes the depth and breadth of a human being and all that goes into the way we make our decisions and how they impact us. So I want to talk about that, and I hope that will be beneficial for you today. Certainly, I'm not the first person who has studied shame or looked at it, and I'm going to be using some of the experts that I took a lot of information from what they shared. The first one is Dr. Mario Martinez, and Dr. Martinez is a neuropsychologist. He's also the author of what is titled The Mind-Body Code, and he's developed the theory of biocognitive science, which in his studies he's discovered that there's an important and a significant correlation between cultural history, beliefs, thoughts, and how they affect our physical and emotional health. Now, Brené Brown is known by many, and she's a research professor at the University of Houston. And she spent the past 16 years studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. And she's the author of 4 #1 bestsellers, including The Gifts of Imperfection and Daring Greatly. Carl Jung referred to shame as the swampland of the soul. And when speaking of shame, Dr. Brown stated, I'm not suggesting that we wade out into the swamp and set up camp. I've done that, and I can tell you that the swampland of the soul is an important place to visit. But you would not want to live there. I'm hoping we can put on our hip waders today and spend this time thinking about the power, the depriving messages that we receive from shame, and how we might free ourselves of that grip and help free ourselves from delivering that grip on others. So let's begin with the definition. One of the first things to understand about shame is that it is not the equivalent of guilt. Guilt is an adaptive force. It tells us that we've done something wrong. It offers us a positive social and emotional response to guide us towards reshaping our future choices. But shame's message tells us who we are failing to be, and that we should be ashamed of who we are. And it's often paralyzing. Both are used and both are certainly powerful motivators used to reshape our direction. But they also have an incredible power to reshape us internally. See, we spend our lives making summations that point to our personal value. And this begins for us from the very first day of our life, when we hear words and we see symbols that start to cultivate imagery and meaning in our lives. And they also establish our cultural beliefs and values, which in turn seems to be shaping our biological response to stimuli. Whether it's sending a message of something we should fear or brings us comfort, things that we take acceptance in or things that we shame, and so on. See, we do not create meaning on our own. Many people are going to co-author portions of your journey, and at some early point in our lives, most of us absorbed what would be false beliefs that caused us feelings of shame. And as a result of not being seen or feeling loved or valued or understood, we came to our own understanding that we were not being loved because there was something wrong with us. So while some individuals were told outright that they were not okay, that they were in fact stupid, bad, or undeserving, others just came to the conclusion that there was something wrong with them by the way they were being treated. Most of us can recall an experience from our youth that left a lasting impression of our personal worth. Junior high dodgeball. That's the one that comes to mind for me. See, I remember those team captains who stood up against the bleachers and they decided who would be on whose team. And we all waited for them to point at you, anxiously hoping that you would be one of the first chosen. But of course, they were going to pick people they had an alignment with, or maybe people that they thought would help win the game. Either way, depending on when you were chosen, whether you were near the front or if you were dead last, it seemed to have a big impact on us and left us with a lot of feelings and emotions for that day. So if you were chosen first, it's likely that you had some very strong and happy memories. But if you weren't, if you were further down the line, it may have had a very different impact on you. See, being part of a team or a tribe or a family or any specific group has become very paramount for all of us. See, the most important thing for our lives is to be part of a tribe. From the earliest tribes, we've learned that the assembly of a cooperative group could keep our babies alive and protect our elderly and weak and sick, and it provided nourishment and warmth, even gave us meaning and purpose. And it defined the rules, the laws, what would be our honor code or amore of that group. See, there's order and bond of agreement as to who we are and what we believe. Shame may have some of its origin derived from a fear that weakness could get us kicked out of our tribe or our group. And evolutionarily, that literally meant the making of our own deaths. So it's possible to reason for us to hide our own weakness for fear of being kicked out of our own tribe. These are pictures that my sister took on a trip that she went to in Tanzania with my mother. They spent a lot of time with the Maasai tribe and really thought they were such a kind people, very lean, very tall. In fact, they're the tallest people in the world. And that little shepherd boy right in the center, he was taking his place that day, herding the goats and cows, as directed by his father. And his job is to defend them from predators, which usually a predator is a lion in this case. Boys as young as 7 sent by their fathers to spend their entire day guarding the animals with a stick. Can you even imagine? And then the women, they will spend up to 8 hours of their day just gathering water for sustainability. They also create a prickly barrier of weeds that surrounds their encampment in order to keep danger out as they sleep. And the cattle and goats are so important that they are inside the circle. even so center to the circle that the family's huts are outside of them for their own protection. Now, the Maasai people do not eat their cows. They're a great source of food for them, though, from their milk and from the harvesting of the blood that they gather by puncturing the cow's loose skin on the neck with a bamboo arrow. They're very careful not to kill their cattle. The rules and culture of the tribe of the Maasai creates a unified collective. And without those rules, the collective would fall apart. And in fact, the tribe would be destined for some type of a disaster. And thus, rules can literally be sacred. Sometimes they are literal commands or laws. And sometimes, in more subtle form, they are social norms or mores. Rather than defining what is right and wrong, they define right and rude. As a collective, it is decided which are widely observed and considered in the culture to have greater moral significance and are held sacred. This is how we do things around here. It becomes a very important part of understanding who we as a people are in the culture that we live. I want to also share that the Maasai people have experienced such a devastation of drought that they have lost a good number of their cattle. And some of their young men are looking for other ways for sustainability, moving beyond the tribe, moving to places where they can become more educated. And they're learning a lot about a new world, which is threatening to the tribe itself. Sound familiar? Maybe some of you have had those experiences with your own children as they've gone out to venture into the world and figure out who they are. How does that make us feel? And what messages do we send to them because of it? Well, how do we acquire shame? Based on the outcome of that little warrior boy, he's going to go home clutching some stories in his heart of whether he was very capable and powerful and meaning of acceptance, or did he have a failure? Did he lose an animal? Did something happen that was costly for the tribe that day? If so, he may be ingesting a message of shame. And for all of us, these stories are about receiving criticism for maybe cherished projects or dreams, or for who we are. Maybe they're stories about not fitting in, not getting a certain job, a promotion, or even making the kind of salary we would hope to make. Maybe they're stories about your background or our childhood. Maybe they're about something we lack, an amount of knowledge, a certain talent or skill. After all, it really does seem to matter if we are muggles or wizards. Either way, these stories seem to stay with us, and they walk around alongside us every day and become kind of a shadow trailing behind us. And the specifics, they don't really matter, because the underlying and the overarching message or belief is the same. You're not enough, or maybe you're too much. You're flawed. I mean, you're seriously flawed. In fact, you're so flawed that you are unlovable and unacceptable. You are wrong, inherently wrong. Shame can make us see things that aren't there. It can keep us quiet, isolate us, make us feel alone. It can seem like we're the only one who struggles, like we're the only one who's made a poor decision or is unsure, insecure, and afraid, which is why it's so important to process our shame and to share it. Because in doing so, shame shrinks. In doing so, our hearts expand, and the load we're carrying gets lighter. We put words to nebulous feelings. We realize that indeed we are not alone. Shame sticks to us like a burden. And since we can't shake it off, we have to endure it and carry it with us. Is it any wonder that in recent studies they found that humiliation is more intensely felt than the emotions of happiness, excuse me, or even anger? Shame tells us we are at the least at risk of being disconnected from the group. And in an effort to numb that kind of pain, consciously or unconsciously, we're going to use some negative coping strategies. So today, we're the most in debt, the most addicted, the most medicated, the most overweight cohort in U.S. history. Interestingly, shame is correlated with the negative outcomes of anxiety, depression, bullying, and suicide. It's also found that guilt, again, a message that I did something wrong, not that I am something wrong, correlates in an opposite direction. It creates empathy and understanding another's perspective. In fact, what we failed to do up against who we want to be, and that's a very adaptive behavior. So Dr. Mario Martinez, who I found fascinating, particularly for this part of his conversation, tells us that our entire human race shares in 3 definitive relationship wounds that transcend all of our cultures. And they're 3 archetypal wounds, which are shame, abandonment, and betrayal. And each of these wounds has a biological, a cognitive, and a disease response in our bodies. Let's start with shame. Its initial response in our body is to create a pro-inflammatory reaction, which creates feelings of being hot and humiliated. Sound familiar? And our body feels like it's being attacked. Just like it does when we have a cut or an infection, the body sends a defense force. As a protective response, it tells the body to eliminate the cause of injury and send blood cells to clear out pathogens and irritants. This is done through inflammation, and the systems affected by shame and those wounds are the autoimmunes and the diseases that come from autoimmune diseases, such as I'm trying to think of a number of those diseases. We have thyroid issues, pancreatic issues, so many places where what literally is happening is the body is attacking itself. This response can be triggered by criticism, bullying, blame, judgment, mean teasing, name calling, and guilt trips, and ridicule. They're all going to elicit this body's response. Our body's response. Next, abandonment, which often feels cold and fearful, and it creates an adrenal response from a corticosteroid to respond to the fight or flight response. And that corticosteroid is called cortisol, and it's sent to aid in that response. Knowing that danger and stress have been triggered, it releases an increase of glucose, and it halts insulin production because we need more energy in the aid of fighting off what's perceived as an attack. This metabolic increase is for our own protection. And over time, an increase of cortisol leads to an increase of blood sugar, which can turn into weight gain, impaired immune function, and diabetes. It's correlated to being ignored, neglected, left emotionally or physically, not being taken seriously, or not being heard. All of those things trigger that cortisol increase. Now, betrayal increases feelings of frustration and even rage, and sends an adrenaline to elicit the fight or flight response. And by redirecting the blood flow away from our vital organs, it increases blood flow to the muscles because it's in for a fight. Dilates our pupils, increases our blood pressure and our heart rate and respiration. And the respiration starts to slow down. In fact, your mind is going into survival mode, and those negative impacts on our body affect the cardiovascular system. It can cause ulcers, and it even damages our own DNA, leading to premature aging, depression, anxiety, and causing miscarriages. These processes are triggered by broken trust, being lied to or cheated on. If you were talked about maliciously, or when someone doesn't take responsibility for something they've done to you. So let me share, excuse me, a couple of examples of how shame from within our cultural beliefs can shape and affect our mental, our biological, and our physiological state. You see, menopause is a universal event. It happens to most women in the biological aging process. However, the experience itself is not universal at all. In Western society, where the culture is centered on maintaining youthfulness and being attractive, our value goes to those who are young or can maintain an ageless profile. Menopause is on average 50% more likely to include inflammation and heat flashes for Western women. But menopause is more likely to not cause inflammation in Japan because it's considered a renewal of years. The hot flashes are seen like a new spring, a time of increased energy. So fewer women are reporting those same symptoms. Now, the Navajo women, they embrace an aging cycle because the elderly women, they're invited into a tribal council where they're revered for their years of wisdom and knowledge where they can share. More idolized, more cherished as they age. They have a very different feeling about the aging process. The concept of mental illness is long been a varied response all over our world. Some places don't even acknowledge that it is such a thing. They send in spiritual healers to Vietnamese families when they are experiencing what we would consider some form of mental illness. They send someone to pray over them and burn incense in the home. In India, Pakistan, there is a reluctance to accept any diagnosis of mental illness or mental retardation because it severely reduces the chance of any member of your family getting married. So in early September of 2015, one of Pakistan's most watched television news channels reported that Bilwalo Bhutto Zardari, who is the chairman of the prominent Pakistan People's Party, suffered from bipolar disorder. It created a journal frenzy. They wouldn't give up their source, and nobody could clarify where the source came from, but the irresponsible journalism left this man branded as being unfit, a lunatic, a psychopath, and ready for a madhouse. He still maintains power in that party, but at that time it had tremendous impact on him. Pakistan went on in 2016 to actually rule through the Supreme Court that schizophrenia is not a mental illness. So depending on where you live, the culture is absolutely going to impact your view of the world, and it's going to impact how your body responds to that view. Our culture is not in a vacuum of understanding. It's wide, much wider than that. For a minute, I'd like you to just stop and consider one of the many groups where you are counted on as a shared support. Because this shaming thing, it happens everywhere, in all tribes, groups, cohorts. Anything you join and dare to leave or challenge your friends, neighbors, whether it's the PTA or a cluster group, co-workers, gang member, political cronies, fellow yogis, or other drug addicts, even in play dates, when we move away from by suggesting a new moral code, you're going to feel it. Can you think of a time when you have had to do that? Or even a time now when you'd like to do that, when you'd like to speak out against something but are fearful of the repercussion? See, our amazing brain, it has a very protective firewall. And whenever we introduce the unknown, it sits up tall and it takes notice, immediately sending protective factors to remind us that we are stepping outside of what can be predicted and controlled. Things we can't predict are considered a radical risk for the brain. Whether that change is positive and could create a new place for us to grow and even explore, this is still a risk. Our lower brain, it really is there to protect us from those risks. Any risk, good or bad, change, good or bad, it's going to send a message that there is possible threat. Sometimes we self-impose shame. Self-shaming can happen when we are afraid of our choices, that maybe they could result in being rejected by the relationships that we value, or we don't see ourselves living up to the tribal rules or the culture. And in this case, shame has little, if anything, to do with moral guilt, has everything to do with our personal feelings. So let's go over a few things that we often think should include some form of shaming. Is being abused something that you did wrong? Is having 15 pounds to lose after you've had a baby something to be shamed for? Or the choice to drink Coca-Cola or any other substance? Is being too tired to read a story at the end of the day? Is that something we should feel shame over? Is feeling disconnected from a child who hurts you a moral proclamation on your own life? We seem to be very clear that we're wired for struggle, but we forget that we're also worthy for love and belonging. In order for shame to survive, Dr. Brown says, shame is cultivated in secrecy, in silence and judgment. And as individuals, we can certainly nurture and grow shame all by ourselves, particularly by ourselves. Sometimes we are caught walking around and we're continually exhausted, making ourselves miserable. Maybe we feel guilty because we're working so hard for the benefit of everyone else, pretending to be some version of ourselves that's acceptable to a tribe or any other group. Particularly in the work that we do, have you watched the evolution or the deterioration of families that we are serving? Because if so, it's likely that you're bound to see what arises in the human spirit to create the feelings of unity and acceptance in their family. Some of you are going to see individuals who regress and turn away from change. Have you ever considered that this is an attempt to maintain the cohesion of their own family, or an effort to demonstrate they did not abandon the family way? This is applicable to families with cultures of substance abuse as much as it is to those with a culture of strong educational tie, or never having graduated high school, or losing weight. See, people we care about have a way of letting us know when we change. And they have many ways of showing it verbally and non-verbally to let us know if that's an acceptable change or not. Even when things are going well, we can send out a dress rehearsal for tragedy, just so we're prepared. You might go tuck in your tiny little lovey at night, big old freckles on their face out, sound asleep. And while they're there sleeping, you have these thoughts that pop into your head from what I call it the What If Academy. They flood us with thoughts of horrible imagery or how you could lose this child. And even here, standing here, when in your imperfect, peaceful situation, our fear of vulnerability has a sabotaging even our own joy. So what do we do to counteract the poisonous effects of shame and the fear of being vulnerable? If the psychological body has gone so far as to send a defensive force to protect us, then science would say we send an even more powerful force to fight the antagonist. Interestingly, what they've discovered is fighting fire with fire, in this case, does not heal shameful feelings in our lives. But what does work is something that soothes the attacker. Dr. Martinez calls these the healing fields. And for shame, it is the offering of honor. For abandonment, commitment. And for betrayal, a showing of loyalty and value. Some of the problems we run into when trying to heal our emotional wounds is solely working to change our stinkin' thinking, if you will. If you had an opportunity to talk about stinkin' thinking, if you've ever worked therapeutically in a cognitive therapy setting, you talk a lot about stinkin' thinking. But we do not get abandoned or betrayed and shamed just intellectually. We're going to feel it biologically. So utilizing our cognitive skills and just saying, hey, I'm worthy, is not enough because it doesn't access the whole experience, the experience that happened to us biologically and physically, along with the cognitive impacts. So how do we use the healing fields? For beginners, You can process. Ending your shame, abandonment, and betrayal will require that you are aware of it and where you're feeling it in some part of your body. And these wounds need to be brought forward so that you can work on them, linking our thoughts to our biology, where we are feeling the emotion. Then we're going to honor and validate those feelings. And I know this is not going to be a cakewalk, because it turns out that being this vulnerable takes a lot of compassion and courage. Even if that's the courage you're reflecting to yourself, it has to be okay. How many of us shy away from giving ourselves permission to hurt, even if that's a childhood hurt? Then we create a new neural map. When we give an opportunity for our feelings to be heard, to appreciate them, we create a new way of thinking for ourselves, and we can recall and connect the healing messages. We offer a memory of a time when we were committed or someone who committed to us. We think of opportunities when we were valuable with what we gave. So this is literally you stopping for a minute and thinking, wow, I'm really not appreciated here. They really don't need me. And maybe even you've had proof of that. Someone has said something that was dismissive or downright rude. And you take a moment to think about how that makes you feel, and then feel that flood of emotion with thoughts also of times when you have been very valuable, when you have had much to offer and things went well. And that should help reduce and release some of that other negative energy that's now processing through your body. Because we want to be able to demonstrate that we are loyal. And at the pinnacle of all humiliation and shameful thoughts, we're going to send a message of honor to ourselves, because it creates self-respect and it gives us merit to our efforts. These skills can be transferred also to our interactions with our children or partners or work associates. Really, it's for all of our relationships. So if someone feels like you've shamed them, you find some way to honor them. In some way, if they feel betrayed, you express that they are valuable to you. And if you feel or they feel abandoned, we focus on our commitment to them. You need to take a moment and build a time of accountability for your own life. Start with even your earliest honorable acts. So I'm suggesting this is a journaling opportunity, maybe even a preventative measure where you write down things that do demonstrate where you have honor and value, and that you can recall upon when it gets hard. Because let's be honest, when the stinking thinking does start in, it's kind of hard to stop the flow of thoughts. So possibly writing some of these down will give us somewhere to go to for practice as we start in these earlier days. Even if you didn't honor a sacred code of your tribe of origin, you have definitely honored something. Honored your creative path, honored a work ethic, honored your own health. Whatever it is, writing it all down will be something you can go back and reflect on as these emotional feelings start to populate other responses in your body. What else can we do? Well, it'd be really great if we could be better co-authors for our children. Teaching children that their worth is not negotiable can be solidified as we respond to their daily struggles. And if mistakes do not taint us and make us unlovable, then we need to be more thoughtful, have better verbal and nonverbal cues that demonstrate that. And when we don't demonstrate that, when our own actions don't reflect on that, let's stop and honor our own feelings for the moment and make some new compassionate messages for us. And then we'll be able to do that better for our children next time. I have this 3-year-old grandson whose R's all sound like W's. So let me quote him as he came through the door yesterday. He marched in quite indignantly, holding a broken toy, and he came in proclaiming, "Woman broke my car. Woman is to blame." Hearing those words from such a small child really made me cringe, especially since I've been working and studying this topic. I looked at that little red-headed fireball and I said, Roman isn't here. He didn't break your toy. Roman is not to blame. And he busted into tears saying, I'm to blame? I said, no, no one is to blame. I'm so sorry your toy got broke and it's not going to work anymore. Maybe we can fix it together, or I can help you find another one to play with. But I have to be honest, I had to chew on my own tongue to prevent myself from reminding him that money didn't grow on trees, or maybe I should refer to Santa Claus and tell him, don't forget, that guy's always watching, just in case you forget and have to create some imaginary truth about how things get broken. See, apparently this way of communication really does take some change. It needs to be intentional parenting and intentional apologies too. We're literally shifting our fear-based energy to one of courage and acceptance. This also means we're aware when our own fears of looking at who this child is becoming, our own shame of what we are fearing or looking at, maybe if other moms think of us or our kids look at us and see us poorly, how does that impact us? Maybe our own expectations, like I can't even believe, why would this child do something like this? And of course, we have our own questions of just being a legitimate parent, how we've earned the right to do so, and if we're good enough at that. So in order to evolve, we're going to have to move from where we are at currently. Your destiny, your direction, it was to create the very best you. So can we radically say we're going to cause some abandonment, something or someone, a group, even a code or values, that's going to happen because we choose to move on, we choose to change, we choose to question, to be creative, to explore, to take courage and make leaps of faith. We choose reform. Can we radically accept that change for us and change for others around us may feel like abandonment, and acknowledge that reality for yourself and for those you care about? That may give you a very different perspective when your child leaves your political affiliation or says, hey, I'm going to try a new church this week, or I'm going to go and get a tattoo, even if that tattoo says, I love mom. It creates some very strong feelings for us in our own little group, our own little family, our own little tribe, because we feel the sense of abandonment. We feel the fear of the loss of those connections that brought us together in the rules of who we were going to be. So some things we can do. Start by naming your own truth, your own north. Where are you at? Find your true north. It may be more critical than ever today, because particularly in a world where the social media tweets and posts are all thumbs up of inclusion versus snide remarks of condemnation, in today's world where those things literally make money, our Western world has become a marker for moral behavior rather than right and wrong. So what is your vision of your ultimate good? Something that is worth defending, even at the cost of unpopularity and exclusion. I certainly see that when I sit down with new families who are moving towards becoming foster parents, that they are moving towards what others may think is an unpopular decision, and it's going to have impact on their lives. Does that mean it should not be a choice they make? I'm going to suggest that you write your truth down so you can reflect on it, so you can come back to it when other things come popping into your life that are also true about how hard this is, or how difficult it is to maintain relationships, or that there are those who feel abandoned because you've moved in a new direction, or even that they feel like you abandoned them and you feel abandoned by them. That might help us a little bit. Then let's look at the acronym FLY. First, love yourself. Oh, that's a concept, right? Not one that we promote very loudly because it seems to scream some message of, oh, you're selfish, or you seem to be so self-centered, or this is some thing that you do in your youth, not as we age. We don't spend that much time on ourselves. We're a selfless people at this point. But of all the negative voices, is yours the loudest? Have you ever been telling it enough, really? Have you ever been wealthy enough, thin enough, whether you were 6, 16, or 36? If the answer is no, if you can't think of a time when you were enough in whatever thing it is that seems to be nagging at you, then it's not a weight issue or a talent issue or a money issue. It's a shame issue, and you're carrying it around as your most reliable relationship. Time to get a new one. A change cannot take root unless, as an individual, you have the self-worthiness to sustain the change. That becomes a critical factor in your healing. So let's look at empathy for those who shame us. What are they really trying to say? By their messages, are they also feeling abandoned and alone, deserted or unprotected? This exercise is about breaking the spell that shame has on us. Because when we more deeply look at others, when we have more compassion for where they're at, it has this crazy effect of bouncing back and impacting us too, increasing our capacity for love and understanding of ourselves. We may never return to some of our tribe's cultural path. We're going to be generous and thoughtful of others who are struggling with those same shaming feelings, because who isn't really? Can you recognize the message of shame versus one of guilt? Can you look at that in your own life? And what are you measuring? Is the message that you're sending or recording for yourself or others that you're never good enough? Or who do you think you are? Or is it a message of adaptation? Asking yourself to take a measured look at the mistake in an effort to make change. That's guilt. And guilt should offer a productivity as a solution, not collapse, which is often what happens with shame. I love an album titled by Sarah Bareilles called The Blessed Unrest. I think a lot about that because there's this gift that happens inside all of us when we know we need to propel ourselves to some new destiny, that we need to work a little harder, or we should take care of something, or that there's more inside of us. That's a gift. That's what guilt is supposed to do. It's supposed to create an energy and a force to keep trying and moving forward. It's not supposed to stop us and drown us. We need to give shameful feelings a voice. So when someone is feeling hurt, even when you didn't intend for them to feel hurt, don't rush in to say, "We're good, don't worry about it." In an effort to eject the feelings for yourself or even for them, let's slow down and let that content rise from them so that we can give it voice and extinguish it. Ask them, what about that made you feel so shamed? Sitting with someone as they share pain is the truest form of empathy. It's also very difficult because the crazy thing that sometimes happens when someone is telling you that they feel shamed, you start to feel like you may be responsible for that shame. Or maybe there's even indicators that they believe you could have caused some of that. And guess what that creates for you? Your own shame. So this is a hard topic for a lot of people, to sit with one another and talk about those feelings without having them seem to cross-transfer onto one another as you're sharing them. But if it thrives in secrecy and silence, then we have got to extinguish it by giving it a place to speak, a voice, if you will. On April 23rd in 1910, Theodore Roosevelt spoke at the University of Paris. His speech was titled, "Citizens in the Republic." It would become one of the most widely quoted speeches of his career, maybe of anyone's career, honestly. He was a former president at that point. He had left office in 1909. But he was in Paris delivering an address to a large crowd of military, the ministry, and other public officials, and people from the community. And Roosevelt called out cynics who looked down at men who were trying to make the world a better place. And he firmly believed that one learned by doing. It's better to stumble than to do nothing or to sit by and criticize those that are in their arena, as he explained. The poorest way to face life is to face it with a sneer, he said, a cynical habit of thought and speech, a readiness to criticize work, which the critic himself would never try to perform, an intellectual aloofness which will not accept contact with life's realities. All these are marks, not of superiority, but of weakness. Then he delivered an inspirational and an impassioned message that drew huge applause. It would later be quoted by President Nixon at his own resignation, used by President Mandela to inspire a rugby team on to victory, and has been tattooed on the arms of Miley Cyrus and Liam Hemsworth. Why? Because it inspires us to rise beyond the establishment of fear and shaming, and to not abandon those that dare to try, which is the courageous message I wanted to share with you today, is that we can do this. We can do this for ourselves. We can move beyond the pains that seem to be coming to us, and we can absolutely become better co-authors for those we interact with on a daily basis, sending them messages of acceptance and tolerance and hopefulness. But I'd like to end by reading a piece of this speech that President Roosevelt gave at that time. The man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the door of deeds could have been better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. So that is his place, shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Teddy Roosevelt. I encourage you to try something new, put yourself out there. Do not fear your own failings. Do not fear your own shame that you might create for yourself, and certainly find ways to repair that which is coming to you in the form of shame and that which you might be sending out. Thanks so much for joining me. Again, I can't say enough in the appreciation we feel for the hard work that you do every day of your life, loving and caring for children and their families. Thank you.